The night Edward followed the maid, he sat in his black car and watched her teach a whole room of people to read. He saw her kneel beside an old man and help him say a long word. He watched her open a bag and hand out bread to tired mothers. The sight broke Edward so much he could not breathe. Why had he never seen her like this before? Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and how did this story touch you? Now let's dive in. Before that night, Edward lived in big house on Lagos Island. People whispered his name. He owned hotels and tall buildings. He wore clean suits and met with serious men. He kept his life small and private. His house was quiet. Many people worked there. One of them was Hope. She wore the same 2 dresses and moved like a shadow. She made the beds, cleaned the floors, and put food on Edward's table. She always said, "Yes, sir," and left before the sun went down. Edward noticed Hope because of 2 bags. Every evening she carried 2 nylon bags out the gate. One looked like it had food. The other looked full of papers. Edward wondered why a maid would carry papers that looked important. He asked the agency a few small questions. They said she was calm and honest. Her staff file showed no trouble. Edward was not used to mysteries. He liked to control things. Yet the bags pulled at his mind. One day Edward saw her near the front door fixing the straps of the bags. He walked a little closer but did not speak loud. "You are leaving already?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she answered softly. She did not tell him where she was going. Edward kept his eyes on her until she walked out. Her back was straight. Her steps were quick. He felt a small ache in his chest. That night Edward could not sleep. He thought of the 2 bags and the worn shoes on her feet. He thought of his pantry that had food he never ate. He thought of empty rooms he never used. He opened her file and read the small notes. No emergency contacts. No school records. Nothing that explained the papers in her bag. Edward decided to follow her, not to punish her, but to learn her secret. The next evening Edward sat in his car with the cap pulled down and dark glasses on. He watched her walk out at the same time. She did not take a taxi. She walked fast, her slippers slapping on the dusty road. She turned corners like someone who knew every step. Edward followed, keeping far behind. He drove slowly when she climbed into a yellow bus. The bus moved through busy streets Edward had not seen in years. When the bus stopped, Edward watched Hope step off and walk past broken shops and small houses. She walked into a low gate with a faded sign. Edward slowed the car and peered through the cracked window. Inside he saw adults holding notebooks and looking at a blackboard. Hope stood at the front. She had chalk on her fingers. She was teaching. Edward felt the world tilt. He stayed and watched until the class ended. Then he asked himself, how could a maid hold so much light inside her? Edward's hands gripped the steering wheel as he watched Hope close the class with a prayer. The adults clapped softly. Some wiped tears from their eyes. She gave each of them bread from her bag, one by one, as though it was treasure. Edward sat frozen. The woman who washed his dishes by day was saving lives by night. When she stepped out of the gate, Edward sank down in his seat so she wouldn't see him. His chest felt tight. She walked away with her bags empty now, her head bowed but her steps still strong. Edward did not follow her back. He sat in the darkness of his car, replaying what he had seen. Why had she never spoken about this? Why would a maid hide such a gift? The next morning, Hope moved quietly through the mansion. She cleaned Edward's study, dusted the shelves, and carried out the trash. Edward sat behind his wide desk, pretending to read. He watched her reflection in the glass window. He wanted to ask her questions, but the words caught in his throat. "Sir, may I go now?" she asked softly, eyes lowered. Edward nodded, though inside he burned with curiosity. That night, Edward returned to the same street. He parked in the shadows again. He saw the same pattern. Hope arrived with her bags, entered the gate, and taught the class. This time Edward stepped closer. He leaned on the car hood and listened. Her voice was calm but firm. She showed the class how to spell hospital. She told them about filling forms and reading signs. Her eyes shone as she spoke, though her dress was old and her shoes were broken. Edward felt his throat sting. He remembered his own childhood, filled with private tutors and expensive schools. He had never thought of those who had nothing. After class, Edward watched her pack up the chalk and notebooks. She stayed behind to sweep the room before leaving. Her hands moved with care. When she locked the door, Edward saw her pause under the moonlight, clutching the keys to her chest as though she was guarding something precious. The following day, Edward called his assistant. "Find out what that center is called," he ordered. Within hours the report came back. The building was registered as House of Second Chances. It had no big sponsors. The funds came from small donations and volunteers. Edward's heart jumped when he saw one line, "Main supporter, Hope Joseph." He dropped the paper. A maid with almost nothing was the backbone of something so big. That evening, Edward could not stay in his mansion. He paced through the wide halls, past the paintings and gold lamps, yet all he saw was her chalk-stained hands. He sat in his leather chair, whispering to himself, "Why would she give everything when she has so little?" The question kept him awake till dawn. He decided he would not just watch anymore. He had to hear her story. But how could he ask without breaking the secret she clearly wanted to hide? Edward made up his mind. The next time he followed her, he would not stop at the gate. He would go inside. And that decision would change everything. Edward wore plain clothes and left his mansion before the sun went down. He drove the same road he had taken before, keeping his car far from sight. When Hope stepped into the yellow bus with her bags, he followed at a distance. His heart beat harder with each turn. Tonight he would not just watch, he would walk through the gate. The bus dropped her near the small street with broken shops. She walked quickly, her head lowered. Edward parked and followed her steps, careful not to draw attention. When she pushed open the rusty gate, Edward waited a few seconds, then walked inside. The air was warm and smelled of chalk. About 20 adults sat on old benches, holding notebooks with shaky handwriting. Edward stood at the back, unnoticed. Hope stood in front of the blackboard, her voice steady and full of hope. She wrote big letters, making sure everyone could see. "Let's read this together," she said. "Ako esapi, ute 50. The class repeated after her, their voices loud and eager. Hope smiled, the kind of smile Edward had never seen in his house. When the lesson ended, she passed out bread from her bag. Edward watched her place the loaves in each person's hands, treating them like family. Then one of the older women touched Hope's arm. "God bless you, my daughter. You remind me of what my son could have been." Edward's chest tightened. He stepped back, careful not to be seen, but his shoes scraped against the floor. Hope turned quickly. Her eyes locked on him. "Sir?" Her voice shook. She clutched the bag tighter. Edward froze. He had been caught. For a long moment, the room was silent. The students stared at the tall man in plain clothes. Edward cleared his throat. I was passing," he said quietly. "I saw the gate open." Hope's face was pale. She looked at the class, then at Edward. She did not speak. Instead, she lowered her head and began to sweep the floor as if nothing had happened. Edward felt shame burn in him. He walked out quickly and sat in his car. His mind was loud. He had seen the truth up close. The woman who worked in his house lived a second life full of sacrifice. The next day at the mansion, Hope moved with even more silence than before. She did her work quickly and kept her eyes on the ground. Edward tried to speak once, but the words failed. She only nodded and left with her 2 bags as usual. That evening, Edward did not follow her. He sat in his study instead, reading the small report about the House of Second Chances again and again. One line in the report caught him. Founder's story, inspired by her mother's death. She could not read hospital forms in time. Edward's chest tightened as he whispered, "So that's why." For the first time in years, the billionaire felt helpless. He had discovered her secret, but now the question tore at him. Would Hope ever forgive him for crossing into her hidden world? The memory of that night would not leave Edward. He had seen Hope's eyes when she noticed him in the classroom, full of fear, not pride. She had hidden her secret for so long, and now he had stepped into it without her permission. The following morning, Edward waited in the dining hall. Hope came in to set the table. Her hands moved fast, her eyes still fixed on the plates. Edward cleared his throat. "Hope," he said softly. She stopped, her shoulders stiff. "Yes, sir?" Edward leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her fingers gripped the spoon tightly. She shook her head. "Because it is not for telling, sir. It is for doing." Her words cut deep. Edward had nothing to reply. He only watched her leave the room quietly, carrying her 2 bags once more. That night, Edward sat in his car again, parked near the small gate. He did not enter. He only watched from a distance as Hope taught and served. The image of her leading a class with chalk-covered hands stayed in his mind. But this time something was different. Hope's voice carried more pain than before. He realized she thought his presence meant danger, that her dream might be crushed if the truth spread. Days passed like this. Edward said nothing, Hope said nothing. But inside Edward's heart, something was growing. He wanted to help her, not as charity but because she was building something bigger than herself. Still, he knew money was dangerous. It could turn pure things into cold business. One evening, Edward sat in his study with a folder open before him. His assistant had collected more details. He read about how House of Second Chances began. Years ago, Hope's mother had fallen ill. They rushed her to a hospital, but her father could not read or write the forms given to him. By the time someone came to help, it was too late. Her mother died. Edward closed the folder, his eyes wet. For the first time in years he cried. He saw Hope, a young woman carrying a pain too heavy, choosing to turn it into hope for others. The next morning, Edward made a decision. He called Hope into his study. She stood at the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I know your story," Edward said, his voice low. Hope's face turned pale. "I read about your mother. I read about what you were trying to build," Edward continued. "And I want to help." Her eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head firmly. "No, sir. If rich men touch it, it will no longer belong to the poor. It will lose its meaning." Edward was struck silent. She was not afraid of money, she was afraid of losing her dream. The room was heavy with silence. Finally, Hope bowed her head and whispered, "Please let me go, sir. I cannot serve two houses at once." And with that, she placed her maid's apron on the table and walked out, leaving Edward staring at the door, his heart breaking in a way he had never known before. The mansion felt empty without Hope. The rooms were spotless, but the silence was heavier than before. Edward walked through the halls, but every corner reminded him of her. Her soft steps, her quiet "yes, sir," and the chalk stains he once saw on her fingers. He told himself it was just a maid leaving. But deep inside he knew it was more. Weeks passed. Edward buried himself in business meetings and contracts, but nothing filled the hollow place inside him. One evening as he drove through the city, his eyes caught a banner stretched across a busy street. It read, "Fundraiser for House of Second Chances." Edward pulled over and stared. Hope was moving forward without him. She had chosen her dream over safety, over comfort, even over a steady income. Something inside Edward stirred. He knew he had to go. On the night of the event, Edward entered the small hall quietly. The walls were decorated with handmade posters showing children and adults learning to read. At the front stood Hope, wearing a plain dress, her voice strong as she addressed the crowd. "We are here because no one should lose a mother, a father, or a child just because they cannot read or write," she said. Her words silenced the hall. People listened, some with tears in their eyes. Edward's chest tightened. He wanted to stand up, to tell everyone who she really was, to declare her courage. But he stayed in the back, hidden among the crowd. He watched as she spoke with fire in her eyes, her voice steady even though her hands trembled slightly. When the pledges were called, Edward's name was read out. Hope's head snapped up. She searched the hall and her eyes landed on him. For a moment the world stopped. Her lips parted, but no words came. Edward only gave a small nod. After the program, Hope walked toward him slowly. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her eyes glossy. Edward looked at her, his voice calm but heavy with truth. "Because what you are building is bigger than you. And I want to stand beside you, not above you. Let me help, not as charity but as a partner." Hope's hand shook. She turned her face away. "I don't want to sell my dream to money." Edward stepped closer. "Then don't sell it. Guide it. Protect it. I will only give what you allow. But the world needs more of this, Hope. And you cannot carry it alone." Her breath caught. For the first time she saw something in Edward's eyes she had never noticed before. Not power, not wealth, but respect. That night Hope could not sleep. She turned the words over in her mind. Could she trust him? Could a billionaire truly understand the weight of her dream? The next morning the answer came in the form of a letter. It was from Edward's foundation. The title read, "Proposal for National Expansion," directed by Hope Joseph. Hope held the paper with trembling hands. If she accepted, everything would change. Hope stood at the entrance of the literacy center, holding the letter Edward had given her. Her heart pounded. She thought of her mother, of that night in the hospital, of the pen her father could not use. She thought of the adults who came to her class with hope in their eyes, and of the children who sat outside the door listening. Could she carry all this and still trust a man whose world was built on money? Days turned into weeks. Hope worked harder than ever, but the burden grew heavy. The center was too small. People were turned away because there were not enough chairs. One evening as she closed the door, she saw Edward waiting outside. He did not wear his usual suit. His eyes were tired, his voice soft. "Hope," he said, "I am not here as your employer. I am here as someone who believes in you. You can keep full control. I will only give what you need. But please, Don't let fear stop you from reaching more lives. Tears filled her eyes. For so long she had fought alone. Could she finally accept help? She nodded slowly. If I agree, the dream must stay pure. Promise me that. Edward placed a hand on his chest. I promise. Months later, the launch day arrived. The hall was filled with people, reporters, and children dressed in bright colors. A new signboard hung proudly at the front. Hope Joseph Literacy Center. Edward stood beside Hope, but he stayed a step behind her, letting her name shine. Hope gave a speech. Her voice broke with emotion as she said, "This center is not built by money. It is built by pain turned into hope, by hands that refuse to stop giving, and by the belief that every person deserves a second chance." The crowd rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Edward looked at her with pride, not the pride of a billionaire, but of a man who had learned what true greatness meant. As the ceremony ended, Hope walked outside, where the evening sun painted the sky. Edward joined her. For a moment they said nothing. Then he whispered, "You've changed me, Hope. More than money, more than power ever could." She turned to him, her smile gentle. "And you have shown me that even wealth can serve, if the heart behind it is true." They stood there, side by side, not master and maid, not billionaire and worker, but two souls bound by a dream larger than themselves. The center gates opened and the first group of students walked in, holding new notebooks. Laughter and hope filled the air. Hope felt her mother's memory close by, warm and proud. Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. He handed it to her. "This is yours. The first of many centers across Nigeria. From today the dream belongs to the people and to you." Hope held the key tightly, her eyes shining. For the first time in her life she did not feel alone. And so began a journey that would touch countless lives, proving that true wealth is not measured by money, but by the courage to lift others into the light. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us keep bringing you more stories. Turn on the bell so you don't miss what's coming next.